Mr. Organ.
Hello, I am Rabbi Gerald Sussman, and I will be your guest host for today. And I also want to thank Reggie and Ken for their work in making this and so many other things all happen. I have been the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Staten Island, located in Port Richmond, since 1982. I've also been involved in many interfaith activities and social service activities on Staten Island. I'm a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and also serve as volunteer executive director of the Union for Traditional Judaism. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Benita Nathan Sussman, and she is a volunteer with Kulanu and serves as its first vice president. She is a graduate of Yeshiva University, Stern College, and has a master's degree from Columbia University and another one from the Jewish Theological Seminary. She is on the editorial staff of Kulanu magazine and Kulanu board liaison for the Kulanu academic cohort and coordinator of new communities. The photographs of her travels have been published and exhibited, and we also have been married for 44 years. Well, Bonnie, can you tell us how you got involved with Kulanu for the first in the beginning, and then we'll hear about what Kulanu actually is.
Sure. There was a period in around 2002 or so, maybe later, that I had the privilege of teaching at the Academy for Jewish Religion, a small rabbinical school. And they had a retreat, and I went to the retreat, and one of the guest speakers was a Jew from Uganda. And he talked about the Abiyadaya and the emerging Jewish community in Uganda. And I said, Jews in Uganda? I can't believe it. How can I volunteer? So on a piece of paper, he wrote the name Harriet Bograd, who's the president of Kulanu, with her phone number. And that's sort of how it all began. We asked to go to Uganda. She said, too many volunteers this summer. I said, where can you send us? And she said, well, we have this small emerging community in India. Would you be interested in going? Rabbi, would you like to tell us something more about Kulanu?
Yes. Well, Kulanu is a group that deals with returning, emerging, and isolated Jewish communities around the world. When we speak of returning, we really speak of two categories. One you might call lost tribes, groups that believe that they have Jewish ancestry from remote times and now want to return to be part of the Jewish faith and people. Also, there is another important group of emerging Jewish communities, people who are sometimes called crypto Jews. These are the descendants of people who converted away from Judaism and submerged their Jewish identity because of the Spanish Inquisition. And they make up a fair portion of the population of many Latin American countries. So today, some of them want to return to Judaism, a relatively small number, but quite determined, all over Latin America. And there are also, and also in part of the United States, the Southwest, places like New Mexico. And also there are small groups in Spain, southern Italy, and Portugal. So these are the groups that we call returning. Emerging are groups of people, communities, who, through their own religious journeys, have come to the conclusion that Judaism is the faith for them. Many of them started out as perhaps as evangelicals, And then their studies and their own personal religious development led them to affirm Judaism and to try the best they can to practice Judaism as well. The third category are isolated Jewish communities, and there are a few of these. One notable example is Suriname. And Suriname, which is located on the Caribbean coast of South America, was once a very large and important Jewish community in the 16 and 1700s. But since then, it has diminished, and there are a few hundred people there left trying to keep the community going, and they have not had any regular rabbis or teachers there for many years. Another example would be a group that was actually newly discovered by us in Tanzania, where they are descended from Jewish immigrants who came from Yemen around 3 generations ago and have maintained their identity and their practice of Judaism as well as a certain amount of religious scholarship. And for them, contact with the wider Jewish communities around the world is very important. So again, Kulanu, returning, emerging, and isolated Jewish communities around the world.
Okay, and so we're going to begin the program with a short little video of our travels. Now, Kulanu now deals with 30 countries and hundreds of communities around the globe. Rabbi and I only traveled to a handful or two. So this will first introduce you to some of the communities that we visited, and then we will discuss some of these communities in more detail. Can we please see the first video? So our first travel where we fell in love with this kind of work, it was kind of unbelievable. We went to India, and in India we were shocked by what we saw because we're all familiar with Eastern European Jews, and some of us are familiar with Sephardic Jews that come from the Middle East, but we really were not familiar with Jews from India or emerging Jewish communities that were not recognized for the most part by the worldwide Jewish community because they started practicing on their own, and they live a Jewish lifestyle, and they follow Jewish holidays and customs, and each of the communities are on different levels of development in terms of their Jewish identity. So, Rabbi, would you like to tell us about our first trip to India?
Yeah, it was really a life-changing event. I tried to find out from people in Kulanu what was going on in India, where were we going, and what we're going to find there. and nobody could give me an answer. And finally, someone told me, "We don't know. You go there and you come back and you tell us." Well, one of the things that was most memorable about that trip was the greeting that we got when we came there. We were met at the airport of a city called Vijayawada in Andhra Pradesh province by a delegation that came with a few cars and so forth. And we were going back to the village, and I see there are people standing, marching with the cars on both sides. Then I hear musical instruments. And then finally we came to where we met the community, and people put garlands of beautiful flowers around our necks. And it was just so moving. Now, would that ever happen to a rabbi in Staten Island, to be greeted with garlands of flowers and music and all of that kind of thing? The B'nai Ephraim, as they're called, claim descent from the biblical tribe of Ephraim, and their story is that they first lived in the northern part of the land of Israel, and when that was conquered by the Assyrians in the year 754, they were exiled to Assyria, and then somehow they moved to Iran, from Iran to Afghanistan, Afghanistan to Kashmir, and then somehow to the southeast part of India. And the people were just wonderful people. The material conditions were not all that good. A lot of people did not have running water, lived in houses with dirt floors and thatched roofs, and the whole big family in one room with the cow, with whatever animals, livestock they had kind of out front. But there was a warmth and a togetherness there that one rarely sees in the more developed countries. That imagine having most of your family and friends living within a 15 to 20-minute walk.
In a way, they are the lucky ones because they're surrounded by love. And what was so interesting for me in India was that in America, we talk about doing laundry. We talk about paying for tuition. We talk about the same things that these women who were using outhouses and washing their clothes by the river on old-fashioned scrub boards talked about. Except while we talk about tuition in terms of lots of money, they talked about tuition in small amounts of money. And they worried about the education of their children. And they worried about feeding their family. And they shared recipes. And they talked about exactly the same things we do on Staten Island. And for me, that was very eye-opening.
Yes. And also, they were members of an untouchable caste called the Mariga. And so they were poor by Indian standards, yet there was just so much warmth and so much love. And their dedication to Judaism, to its practice and exploration, was really very, very moving. We kind of fell in love with them, and we decided at that point that we would dedicate ourselves to this organization, Kulanu, again, which means all of us, and to furthering their mission, and also meeting wonderful and loving people.
When we travel, we become part of the family of these people, and we develop long-term relationships with them. So we celebrate their happiness and their joyous occasions online and now on Zoom, and we celebrate and we commemorate their we feel sad with them when they have a loss of a community member, and we try to help them in general to understand and better practice their Jewish, the Jewish religion.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed was that we Americans feel that we're the center of the world. And there, I would get an English language newspaper called the Deccan Times, and I'd look at it, and the article on whatever was going on in the United States was on page 17, and it was kind of a small article. And so that was a good lesson for us as well, that wherever people live, they kind of believe that they are the center of anything important going on.
So the next community we visited was Cameroon, and we're not missionaries. people, communities around the world find us online, and they've tried to contact Jews or rabbis at random, which they can Google or they can find, and very few doors were open to them. Kulanu is one of those doors that remain open, and this community from Cameroon sent us an email and said, "We are practicing Jews in Cameroon, and no one wants to deal with us. Would you like to come and visit us?" And we were kind of okay. And they sent us some pictures of loving faces and happy faces and Jewish ceremonies. And people said to us, "Are you going to fly to Cameroon just because you met people online? You're flying to Africa?" And we said, "Yes, we are. We trust these people, and we're going to go." And we flew to Cameroon, and we also got one of these grand welcomes. We stayed in downtown Yaoundé, and we traveled for Shabbat, an hour and a half outside of the capital, and to a community called Sa. And there we were also greeted with music and timbrels and dancing and song. And to watch a very educated Jewish community that has no running water, and I'd say the only running water were women with jugs on their heads that would run because they pumped the water from some pump somewhere. These were people that were fully educated around the Jewish faith. Shabbat morning, they had a 3-hour service. But before Shabbat, the preparations for Shabbat took all of Friday for the community. They had to catch the fish. They had to chop the wood to make the fire to cook the fish. They had to grind coconut seeds to get the oil out so they could fry the fish. And then the treat among everything else was they baked challah. And this, for me, was one of the most moving experiences because here they sifted the flour. They had a recipe on baking challah. That's the Shabbat loaves that we eat on Friday night and Shabbat. And in a Dutch oven that was over coals and wood, they put this challah, which they braided. And before you bake challah, for large amounts of people, there's a Jewish custom to take the dough and throw it in the fire and burn it.
A small piece of the dough.
A small piece of the dough and say a blessing on it. And this woman in the middle of Cameroon, in the middle of this very tiny remote village, made the blessing on the challah, and then she covered it and baked. We had the most delicious challah for Shabbat. The Shabbat morning service was 3 hours in French and in Hebrew from an Orthodox prayer book. And they sang songs that we sing in our synagogue. And they sang also music that they wrote for themselves for the service. So this was also mind-blowing. A group of people who were so traditional and gave up so much to practice their religion. I mean, so many of these people testified that their families rejected them. And this was very hard for them. And, you know, they felt this, they reached the real faith and they were practicing Jews. Okay, Rabbi, would you like to tell us about our trip to Côte d'Ivoire?
Côte d'Ivoire, yeah, we were in Côte d'Ivoire actually twice. And Côte d'Ivoire is also known as Ivory Coast, but the people there speak French, so in French it's Côte d'Ivoire. And we spend most of the time in the city of Abidjan, and Abidjan is a large and bustling city, and it's quite prosperous. People drive fancy cars, fancy by American standards. And the people that we dealt with were lived in nicer homes than many of us do here on Staten Island. And also, they were educated. There was quite a sprinkling of college and university professors and people with high positions in the government among this group. And they had begun their interest in Judaism with something called the Kabbalah Center, which is the study of Jewish mystical tradition, but how it presents it presents it as a separate spiritual development that is aside from Judaism, that one can be a Kabbalist without being a Jew. But they are connected, and they started that study, and then they deepened their study and their knowledge, and they were again quite proficient in Judaism. And the people in Cameroon learned most of what they did online. And we were the first, let's call it, real live Jewish folks that they had ever met, besides, I guess, themselves. But in Côte d'Ivoire, many of the people were widely traveled, having spent a lot of time in Europe, visited Israel, and actually taken pilgrimages to the graves of the great Jewish mystics in places like Morocco. And one sensed a refinement there and a real dedication to practicing Judaism. And there were also kind of two groups in Cameroon, and we managed to deal with both of them. And they were run, the main people in each one of them were rival professors at the same university that taught the same subject. But so my experience in Côte d'Ivoire was visiting a country which was fairly prosperous and in many ways quite sophisticated, and where people were very much involved in, let's call it, the worldly culture. And again, they, by computer, were able to be in contact with classes, with rabbis and scholars all around the world.
We should always just make clear that a lot of this learning was made possible through the internet. And many years ago, if someone wanted to learn about Judaism, it was very hard. If you didn't have a library or you didn't have a Christian seminary that had a bunch of books on Judaism, or you didn't have access to any kind of Jewish knowledge if you lived away from a Jewish center. And then with the advent of the internet, Judaism got on the plane of religious ideas, and you can Google anything, and you'll find a million different opinions and a million different ways to practice. And the internet actually opened up the possibility for new Jewish communities to emerge around the world. I mean, the thought that there's 30 countries that Kulanu deals with, and we're getting emails almost, certainly weekly, about new groups that are forming. In Latin America alone, we have 90 communities of crypto Jews, of people coming back and saying, I'm really Jewish. My ancestry were persecuted during the Inquisition, and I know that I have Jewish customs in my family, and I am really Jewish. So this is an amazing phenomena that made this possible. And, you know, one of the good things that come out of the internet, not all of the stuff is so good. Okay. Rabbi, would you like, should I talk next about Madagascar?
Okay.
Okay. So we visited Madagascar, and this was also an incredible story. We were getting emails from members of the community in Madagascar. They had been Messianic Christians, or some people call them Messianic Jews. A lot of our groups traveled the route from Christianity into Judaism. And this group in Madagascar called themselves Messianics. And at some point, a group broke away and said, wait, this isn't real Judaism. This is a form of Christianity. And this group broke away. There were fights around it. Both groups still exist. And we decided to travel to Madagascar. First, we sent teachers and we got a bunch of videos and unbelievable pictures from these groups struggling to learn Hebrew and learn how to keep Shabbat and Kashrut and keeping kosher and the Jewish holidays. And they were pretty strong. So eventually, we took a group of 17 people to Madagascar to actually convert this group. The details, we have some videos of it, but I'm not showing those videos right now. They're still practicing, and they have a rabbi that has helped them develop. They translate Jewish texts into Malagasy, the spoken language there, from the Hebrew. They have active children's programming. They have several hundred people now involved in the community. They buy time on television, and it's really very well established and recognized at this point as a real Jewish community there. It's quite amazing, and the community is growing. And Rabbi, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, what's amazing about most of these places is that we, or the world Jewish community, makes basically no effort to encourage this, and the people on their own discover Judaism. Sometimes there's a feeling, sometimes there's more proof of it, or indications of Jewish ancestry. For example, there's a very large community of people practicing Judaism among the Igbos of Nigeria. And they will say, well, we know that our ancestors were Israelites in ancient times. And there are different things that they will point to. For example, in the biblical story of Jacob and the blessing and the fight with his brother Esau, after Jacob takes the blessing that was meant for Esau, he escapes. He runs away at his mother's suggestion to her family that lived at a distant place called Padan Aram. And some of the Igbo people will tell me, well, among the old-time Igbos, there was a law, a tradition or custom, that if you did anything wrong and you ran away to your mother's side of the family, nobody could touch you. So they will say, see, the Bible illustrates this Igbo tradition, among others. They'll also say, for example, that in the Bible, in the Torah, the descendants of the tribe of Gad are listed. They're Eri and Arodi and Areli. And they say, well, one of the main clans of the Igbo is the clan of Eri. So we must be descendants of them. What some of these people, particularly in Africa, will say, that there's something very similar between Judaism and their traditional ways of life before the coming of Christianity. And many of them feel that they were coerced or pressured into becoming Christians and abandoning their original way of life, which some identify with a sort of Judaism. Also, among some of these peoples, we see their adoption of Judaism, their interest in Judaism, as a reaction against colonialism, because some feel that Christianity was forced upon them, or they adopted it through pressure, and they feel that Judaism is a way of asserting their original identities. And one sees this in places such as Nigeria or Ghana. And one of the people in Madagascar, a lovely, very well-educated young woman, pointed to the fact that their conversion to Judaism took place on the same date as the date that the French forced their protectorate upon the Malagasy kingdom. And so, see, on that very day that we lost our independence, we are asserting something which is part of our identity. Also, in Madagascar, there are vague traditions of some kind of Jewish ancestry, but they're vague traditions, or some connection with the voyages of King Solomon to the land of Ophir, which are mentioned in the Torah.
Also, over there in Madagascar, besides claiming Israelite origin, they have a total practice of circumcision there. And there are lots of groups in Africa that practice circumcision, which points them to the place where they may have Jewish roots. Certainly that's true. For the Lemba, we didn't visit the Lemba in Zimbabwe, but the Lemba have preserved certain Judaic practices, circumcision among them, certain laws of kosher slaughtering an animal. The Torah gives certain descriptions of kosher locusts, and the Lemba have the kosher locust thing down pat. What's interesting about the Lemba was they were on the cover of the New York Times about 10 years ago because geneticists studied them, and they had found that in their priestly group called the Buba, in their priestly clan, they have the Kohen gene, like Kohen's, the priestly gene that Kohanim, the priests, have in the Jewish community. This was an odd find for everybody, and it was kind of awakening that they have Jewish origins, and that their surnames are sort of from Yemen. And they feel very strongly that their roots are Jewish and that they come from Yemen, and that they have a strong Jewish practice, and they're culturally, all of them consider themselves Jews.
Even those who practice Christianity at the same time.
And even those who practice Islam at the same time consider themselves of Jewish origin. What we're skipping around a little bit, but in Madagascar, the Prince of Madagascar considers himself of Jewish origin, and he addressed the group when we were there, and he spread his hands in a priestly blessing, and he said he is absolutely a descendant of Israelite community.
Yes, though he maintains his practice of Christianity, and so again, it's things which are not exactly what we're used to. And the royal family in Madagascar, which from what I understand no longer has political power but has considerable cultural influence and status in the country, had their own particular, let's say, taboos, and one of them was against eating pork. And there's some kind of legend that someone brought some pork up to the mountain where they lived, and that caused an earthquake. So there are kind of vague legends and stories of a Judaic background somewhere. But I found Madagascar to be a really fascinating place in which, compared to some of the other countries, more of their original culture survived and was maintained. And it's more than lemurs in Madagascar. The people and the culture themselves are quite fascinating. And again, we have a lot of pro-Jewish sentiment in many of these countries. And again, some of them look at Israel as an example because they say, look where Jews were, especially at the time of the end of the Holocaust. And they were able to pick themselves up and keep going and prosper and establish a Jewish state. And they stand as a good example to us Africans, again, emerging from colonialism. Well, Madagascar is not exactly Africa, but
an inspiration. They see Israel and the Jewish people as an inspiration, and they relate very strongly to the Exodus story of God of Redeemer that took us out of Egypt, and they feel that they are walking that journey, and the Jews are an inspiration to them. I think we could now look at video returning to roots. It's a story of Nicaragua, and we've been to Nicaragua 5 times, which is hard to believe. It's the country that we visited second most after Israel. And in Nicaragua, we met unbelievable people. There was an old established community in Nicaragua that was there at the turn of the century, and we were there. And we conducted weddings. Oh, yeah, you should be aware that not only are there conversions that are done on occasion, not always, but on occasion, but we do weddings, and we were actually there for a kid's bat mitzvah. So can we see the Returning to Roots video?
This is a story about righting the wrongs of history. It is about modern Judaism and what it means to be a Jew today. It is the story of crypto-Jews yearning for the religion of their forebears long after the Inquisition and the forced conversion of Jews in Spain. It is about people finding faith and falling in love with spirituality. And it is the story of Kulanu, a tiny non-profit that supports isolated, emerging, and returning Jewish communities. And its recent trip to Nicaragua, where Kulanu volunteers assisted in changing Jewish history.
Rebbe, you want to tell us more about Nicaragua?
Oh, sure. Well, again, as you mentioned before, Nicaragua, when we first came there was one group that called themselves Congregación Israelita de Nicaragua, and it was some of the people who had been living there a very long time. Again, the first I would say the second Jewish community started around the turn of the last century with immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe who formed a community in Managua. But with the Civil War, most of them emigrated and only a few returned. So here was a group composed of some of these people, some people who just joined because they were attracted to Judaism, and some people who were not fully Jewish according to Jewish law and tradition, but still wanted to practice Judaism. And again, what was very striking was their pride and their joy in the practicing of their faith. That's one community, the first one we were at. But then we met other people there as well who said that they know that their families are descendants of Jews because they kept some customs in their families which are reminiscent of Judaism or distinctive to the people who were the secret or hidden Jews, again because of the Spanish Inquisition, which lasted into the early 19th century. And some of the customs strike us as a little bit odd. For example, when you sweep the house, you don't sweep out the door, but you sweep everything into the middle because you didn't want to bring the garbage past the mezuzah, the Holy Scroll, on the door. There's someone else we know, actually of Cuban origin, but of this kind of background, who did not really know that she was of this descent because the family didn't like to talk about it. And then she found her grandmother's recipes, which were recipes of not only grandmothers, but of their grandmothers and grandmothers going back several generations, and found that there was not one recipe for pork, nor any that combined meat and dairy together, which is contrary to the kosher laws. And so this group, again, wanted to return to Judaism, and we assisted them in that. And now, last I heard, there were 3 different groups, different sort of semi-competing congregations in Nicaragua. But again, one was moved by the great sincerity and the great love that they had. For example, in many of these communities, kosher meat is not available. So what do people do? Well, they confine their diet to rice and vegetables and fish and those kinds of things. And many of the Jewish people I know right here in our own community, if they were in that situation, would not do that. So again, they're willing to give up and to inconvenience themselves for what they think is the right way of
Also,
living, the holy way of living.
Also, these groups have to deal with family estrangement because they get pushed out by their family. What are you doing this weird thing for? You know, we're Catholics, we're whatever other religion we are. What are you changing? And in some of the places, especially in Africa, Judaism has a very poor name. Witchcraft, black magic, and they get pushed out by their families because they want to join these groups. And in the poorer communities, not all the communities we deal with are poor, as Rabbi had said before, but in the poorer communities, they stop working on Shabbat. And often they can't get jobs and work because Sunday is the official day off. So they lose income and they become financially impoverished more because of their choice to practice Judaism. I know in Nicaragua there was a man who I'll never forget. I was like 52 years old. He had heart disease and he had diabetes. And he said, I want to be circumcised because if someday a group will come to want to convert us, some rabbis would see, I'll be ready for it. So the kinds of dedication where parents bring in young boys for circumcision, or they lose work because they don't work on Shabbat, or they suffer family estrangement and community, being pushed out of their old communities. That kind of dedication in America you rarely see for any religious group. So that the full love and the full heart to be part of the Jewish people is huge. And I kind of personally feel that after we suffered the Holocaust and lost so many Jews, it becomes not only our responsibility, but worldwide responsibility to begin to reconstruct Jewish communities around the world or bring them anew. And we see this, like we saw it certainly in Nicaragua and Latin America. And as I had mentioned, there are 90 communities in Latin America that are claiming crypto-Jewish roots and are practicing Shabbat and Kashrut on the level they can. And they're being ostracized by their families and actually by other Jewish groups there.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to mention is that many parts of the world are not as secularized as the United States is. And here, well, some of us are religious, some are not, but whatever. But before we went to Ivory Coast, I was speaking to a local Methodist minister who comes from Ghana, and says, oh, you'll like it in West Africa, because in West Africa, religion is very important for everybody. And one of the important things in everyone's life is to come to some kind of personal spiritual truth and realization. And that's one of the things that I saw there, that religion and faith is very important. And people deal with it very seriously and very deeply. Also, again, I recall what Bonnie was referring to, a meeting a youngish woman in Cameroon who was one of 4 wives and the only Jewish person, the only person who identified as practicing Judaism in that family. And her husband said to her, if you go to the Yom Kippur service, you are out of here. When she returned, all of her worldly goods were packed in suitcases and bags by the door of the family compound. And she returned, and the people of the community helped support her. Or again, in another kind of vein, again in Cameroon, someone told us, here, the day for family events is on Saturday. And if we keep the Sabbath strictly as they do, then we might miss grandma's funeral or a wedding or an important family celebration. And the family does not always take kindly to that and might not understand. But we'll do it anyway, because this is what we think is the way that God wants us to live. And so again, I think one finds a great deal to admire in these communities, and I think people there provide examples for us living in our secularized and skeptical society.
I want to tell a story that happened to us in India, and it's one of my most memorable stories. So they asked me how to bake matzah, and I go, how do you bake matzah? You buy it in ShopRite. I mean, how do you bake matzah? So how do you learn to bake matzah? Of course, you go on YouTube and you pick out some videos that show you how to bake matzah. And actually, for the first time in that small community in the B'nai Ephraim, we baked matzah together. And I bought them the rolling pin, exactly the same that they showed in the video. And they don't use forks in that area. And I had to buy them a fork to make the holes inside the matzah. And they don't have ovens either, so they have hot plates on like gas burners. And on this hot iron plate, we baked the first matzah. And every year since, they've been baking matzah. I think that we should see the third video. It's called The New Jews of Guatemala. Though we haven't been there, it is professionally done, and it tells some of the story as well.
Believe it or not, I had a dream.
Encontramos la necesidad de buscar nuevas respuestas.
In my dream, I saw a rabbi that was on top of the hill, and she was with the shofar. I didn't know it was a shofar at the time.
Edat Israel is my family, and I feel it the first day that I came here.
I didn't know it was. I was dreaming about Rosh Hashanah. So that's what it was like a call. It was my calling. I said, I had to do this.
In Guatemala, believers are in the majority, but religious affiliation is on the move. Many Catholics have embraced evangelical Christianity and other non-Catholic denominations. This is the story of a congregation that experienced over 50% growth in one weekend. Adat Yisrael, the country's only Reformed Jewish congregation, was founded in 2005. Over time, it grew to 30 members, all of them Jews by choice. And with 19 people completing their conversion in January 2019, the next chapter has begun for the new Jews of Guatemala.
Some people say, really? They're choosing to be Jewish? And other people say, that's amazing. Why are they doing this?
It's not about, they read a book somewhere and they thought Judaism was interesting. It is about wanting to change their lives fundamentally and take on a new system of life and a new system of belief and a new system of practice. And they are passionate about it.
Some of these people just have Jewish neshamas, Jewish souls. I think there are just some people who are called to be Jewish.
Es como regresar a donde siempre pertenecí y estuve ausente. Y solamente espero el momento en que puedan decirme por fin bienvenido de regreso a tu pueblo.
After several years of study, a written exam, a baked din, the rabbinical court, hatafat dam brit, a drop of blood from the men, and mikveh, ritual immersion for everyone, Adat Yisrael welcomed its newest members, Los Nuevos Judíos de Guatemala.
And it's complete.
Okay, so we've traveled to other places, even though we didn't get to Guatemala. All of our communities are wonderful like that, and they celebrate with love and with excitement and with enthusiasm. And I certainly believe that the future of Judaism will come from Latin America and Africa and India and Indonesia and faraway places where religion has taken on a much more important role than we see, while it's important in America and in the West. But we do have communities that are merging and closing around the world. We're watching people who want to open up communities and start new ones. Rabbi, would you like to tell us some of the things that you may have learned from all of this travel?
Well, first I'd like to mention that Culano is pluralistic, and not everyone is Reformed. In fact, most of the people who want to return to Judaism affirm Orthodox Judaism, but some are Reformed as well.
Because they come from strictly religious traditions, so they're familiar with rigorous religious practice.
Right, with rigorous practice, yes. What have I learned? I've learned a number of things. One, that people are the same all over the world with the same kind of needs and longings in a very personal way. And among the human needs, I believe, is faith. And also structure and trying to find meaning in one's life. And the search for a relationship with God is an important part of all human existence. And it's very gratifying that people of many different backgrounds are finding for the first time or reaffirming the spiritual values of Judaism. So I think in many ways these groups serve as an example for the Jewish communities in the Western world.
Yes, and you know what I learned? I learned that all people are the same, and their love for each other and their hospitality. You know, in Judaism, we have a very big emphasis on hachnasat orchim, on welcoming guests and showing hospitality to people. In all over the world, we were greeted with open arms, and they were the exemplary of the mitzvah of welcoming guests. And the same problems that rabbis and clergy have in America of how do you attract new members and how do you keep the building open and how do you educate our children? These questions are the same questions that newly emerging Jewish communities are facing all over the planet. And it was an aha moment for me, because you kind of think, well, maybe it's different in Africa or maybe it's different in India, but it's exactly the same kind of show where rabbis think of ways and clergies think of ways to attract people to programs. And in America, rabbis are lucky sometimes when they have 5-6 people come to a program. And in Africa, they feel lucky if they get 5-6 people to a program. And so not everything is huge. Sometimes there are thousands that come, are attracted, hundreds that are attracted to a program as well. But the same fights. How do you get the word out? How do you get kids to be involved and to show respect and to show loving kindness to each other? As that's one of the big mitzvahs of Judaism, to show loving kindness and how to treat the poor and how to treat the weak and the sick in your community. And all of these communities are grappling with the same issues that Jews around the world and other faith traditions also grapple with. And in that, it's been a privilege to actually be involved with this and get the bigger picture that we're all kind of one people.
Yes, and soon we're going to show another video.
We have a video on Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah is at the end of Sukkot, the holiday of Sukkot, and it's the It's the holiday that celebrates the giving and the receiving of the Torah, of the Bible, of the Ten Commandments. And it's a joyous holiday. It's the closing day of the high holiday seasons. And we put together a montage of videos for Simchas Torah around the globe.
Yes, and the Torah scroll is really the most outstanding and deepest symbol of the Jewish faith.
And we have been involved with getting Torahs around the world. In America, synagogues that are closing or Torahs that are damaged have extra Torahs, and they will donate it to us, and we concoct ways to get these Torahs to individuals. And we have lots of stories of people traveling with this Torah on an airplane to Africa or to Madagascar, and what it's like to carry a Torah on an airplane. Okay, so you could see the last video.
את אדוני המבורך, ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד, ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים, ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. אמן.
The outfit that my husband was wearing, the Danites, they claim descendancy from the tribe of Dan, gave him these robes to wear, and they say that it reminds them of a talit with the stripes. I don't know if you noticed, it was white with navy blue stripes that went down, and they gave him a yarmulke, a kippah, that also had this kind of pattern on it, and that is their tribal pattern. And they say, well, they are from the tribe of Dan.
Yes. And the Danites in Ivory Coast are a group of 2 million people. So that is also something important. And some of them are exploring Judaism, just beginning to. Most of those are at least nominally Christians, most of the Danites, and some practice something else entirely that is part of their tradition. And others say, well, we are Danites. We think we're part of the biblical tribe of Dan, so we're trying to, maybe we should go back to all that stuff. And so again, it's most interesting. So I want to thank everyone for taking this little journey with us, and I hope you found it interesting. And again, what is the message? The message is the importance of faith, the importance of belief, of having a way of life of which God is part of that way of life, and that affects how we live every day. And that's part of the message. And the other message is that the Jewish people, despite all of the troubles that we've gone through and perhaps still go through, we have not only survived, but we've been able to maintain a faith joyfully, and we enjoy its practice, and it helps bring us happiness. And I think that's an important message for everyone to think about. And also, we are about to observe Sunday night, Monday, Tuesday, the Jewish festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, which is both the the first fruit dedication of the ancient Holy Temple, and also commemorates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And as I mentioned that to you, and we are preparing here for this holiday, I just my mind goes to some of these communities and to think about what they're doing, what their preparations are, and they indeed, I hope, are extremely joyful. Thank you.